Hi, friends at Shauna May Seneca. I thought that it would be fun to read one of my favorite books to you. Your teachers, Mrs. Dice and Mr. Lofstrand, are friends of mine. As a matter of fact, I used to teach Mr. Lofstrand. So I'm a teacher at Lillian Osborne High School, and I've been making cooking videos for my kids, but I love reading, and I love reading one of my favorite authors, Roald Dahl, and I wanted to read a book to you that my grade 5 teacher read to me when I was in grade 5. And my own kids, they're too little for this book because they still love pictures. But I wanted to read to you a couple chapters a day, and you can watch them when you want. And I love being read to, so hopefully you do too. So this book is called Boy Tales of a Childhood, and it's about Roald Dahl's journey growing up. So let's get through a couple chapters together. The starting point. My father, Harold Dahl, was a Norwegian who came from a small town near Oslo called Sarpsborg. His own father, my grandfather, was a fairly prosperous merchant who owned a store in Sarpsborg and traded in just about everything from cheese to chicken wire. I'm writing these words in 1984, but this grandfather of mine was born, believe it or not, in 1820, shortly after Wellington had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. If my grandfather had been alive today, he would have been 164 years old. My father would have been 121. Both my father and my grandfather were late starters, so as far as children were concerned. When my father was 14, which is still more than 100 years ago, he was up on a roof on the family house replacing some loose tiles when he slipped and fell. He broke his left arm below the elbow. Somebody ran to fetch the doctor, and half an hour later, this gentleman made a majestic and drunken arrival in his horse-drawn buggy. He was so drunk that he mistook the fractured elbow for a dislocated elbow. "We'll soon put it back into place," he cried out, and 2 men were called off the street to help with the pulling. They were instructed to hold my father by the waist while the doctor grabbed him by the wrist of the broken arm and shouted, "Pull, men! Pull! Pull as hard as you can!" The pain must have been excruciating. The victim screamed, and his mother, who was watching the performance in horror, shouted, "Stop!" But by then, the pullers had done so much damage that the splinter of bone was sticking out through the skin of the forearm. This was in 1877, and orthopedic surgery was not what it is today. So they simply amputated the arm at the elbow, and for the rest of his life, my father had to manage with one arm. Fortunately, it was the left arm that he lost, and gradually, over the years, he taught himself to do more or less anything he wanted with just the 4 fingers and a thumb of his right hand. He could tie a shoelace as quickly as you or me, and for cutting up food on his plate, he sharpened the bottom edge of a fork so that it served as both knife and fork all in one. He kept his ingenious instrument in a slim leather case and carried it in his pocket wherever he went. The loss of an arm, he used to say, caused him only one serious inconvenience. He found it impossible to cut the top of off of a hard-boiled egg. So here's a little drawing of his fork knife, and there's his father. My father was a year or so older than his brother Oscar, but they were exceptionally close. And soon after they left school, they went for a long walk together to plan their future. They decided that a small town like Sarpsborg and a small country like Norway was no place for them to make a fortune. So what they must do, they agreed, was go away to one of the big countries, either to England or France, where opportunities to make good would be boundless. Their own father, an amiable giant nearly 7 foot tall, lacked the drive and ambition of his sons, and he refused to support this tomfool idea. When he forbade them to go, they ran away from home, and somehow or other, the 2 of them managed to work their way to France on a cargo ship. From Calais, they went to Paris, and in Paris, they agreed to separate because each of them wished to be independent of the other. Uncle Oscar, for some reason, headed west for La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast, while my father remained in Paris for the time being. The story of how these 2 brothers each started a totally separate business in different countries and how each of them made a fortune is interesting, but there is no time to tell it here except in the briefest manner. Take my Uncle Oscar first. La Rochelle was then, and still is, a fishing port. By the time he was 40, he had become the wealthiest man in town. He owned a fleet of trawlers called Pêcheurs de l'Antique, and a large canning factory to can the sardines his trawlers brought in. He acquired a wife from a good family in a magnificent town as well, and a townhouse as large as a chateau in the country. He became a collector of Louis XV furniture, good pictures, and rare books. And all these beautiful things together with the two properties are still in the family. I have not seen the chateau in the country, but I was in the La Rochelle house a couple of years ago, and it really is something. The furniture alone should be in a museum. While Uncle Oscar was bussing around in La Rochelle, his one-armed brother Harold, my own father, was not sitting on his rump doing nothing. He had met in Paris another young Norwegian called Addison, and the two of them now decided to form a partnership and become shipbrokers. A shipbroker is a person who supplies a ship with everything it needs, and when it comes into port, fuel and food, ropes and paint, soap and towels, hammers and nails, and thousands of other tiddly little items. A shipbroker is a kind of enormous shopkeeper for ships. And by far, the most important item he supplies to them is the fuel on which the ship's engines run. In those days, fuel meant only one thing. It meant coal. There were no oil-burning motor ships on the high seas at that time. All ships were steamships, and those old steamers would take on hundreds and often thousands of tons of coal in one go. To the shipbrokers, coal was black gold. My father and his newfound friend, Mr. Addison, understood all this very well. It made sense they told each other to set up their shipbroking business in one of the great coaling ports of Europe. Which was it to be? The answer was simple. The greatest coaling port in the world at the time was Cardiff in South Wales. So off to Cardiff they went. These two ambitious young men carrying with them little or no luggage. But my father had something more delightful than luggage. He had a young wife, a young French girl called Marie, whom he'd recently married in Paris. In Cardiff, the shipbroking firm of Addison and Dahl was set up, and a single room on Butt Street was rented as an office. From then on, we have what sounds like one of the most exaggerated fairy tale stories of success. But in reality, it was a result of tremendous hard and brainy work by these two friends. Very soon, Addison and Dahl had more business than the partners could handle alone. Larger office space was required, and more staff were engaged. The real money then began rolling in. Within a few years, my father was able to buy a fine house in the village of Llandaff, just outside Cardiff. And there his wife, Marie, bore them two children, a girl and a boy. But tragically, she died after giving birth to the second child. When the shock and sorrow of her death had begun to subside a little, my father suddenly realized that his two small children ought to, at the very least, have a stepmother to care for them. What is more, he felt terribly lonely. It was quite obvious that he must try to find himself another wife. But this was easier said than done for a Norwegian living in South Wales who didn't know very many people. So he decided to take a holiday and travel back to his own country, Norway. And who knows, he might, if he was lucky, find himself a lovely new bride in his own country. Over in Norway during the summer of 1911, while taking a trip in a small coastal steamer in the Oslofjord, he met a young lady called Sophie Magdalene Hesselberg. Being a fellow who knew a good thing when he saw one, he proposed to her within a week and married her soon after that. Roald Dahl took his Norwegian wife on a honeymoon in Paris, and after that back to the house in Llandaff. The two of them were deeply in love and blissfully happy, and during the next 6 years, she bore him 4 children, a girl, another girl, a boy, me, Roald Dahl, and a third girl. There were now 6 children in the family, 2 by my father's first wife and 4 by his second. A larger and grander house was needed, and the money was there to buy it. So there's his mom, maybe on their honeymoon in Paris. She's engaged, and that's Roald Dahl at 8 months, and that is their beautiful mansion that they buy. So in 1918, when I was 2, we all moved into an imposing country mansion beside the village of Radyr, about 8 miles west of Cardiff. I remember it as a mighty house with turrets on its roof and with majestic lawns and terraces all around it. There were many acres of farm and woodland and a number of cottages for the staff. Very soon, the meadows were full of milking cows and the sties were full of pigs and the chicken run was full of chickens. There were several massive Shire horses for pulling the plows and the hay wagons, and there was a plowman and a cowman and a couple of gardeners and all manner of servants in the house itself. Like his brother Oscar in La Rochelle, Roald Dahl had made it in no uncertain manner. But what interests me the most of all about these two brothers, Harold and Oscar, is this. Although they came from a simple, unsophisticated small-town family, both of them, quite independently of one another, developed a powerful interest in beautiful things. As soon as they could afford it, they began to fill their houses with lovely paintings and fine furniture. In addition to that, my father became an expert gardener and above all, a collector of alpine plants. My mother used to tell me how the two of them would go on expeditions up into the mountains of Norway and how he would frighten her to death by climbing one-handed up steep cliff faces to reach small alpine plants growing high up on some rocky ledge. He was also an accomplished wood carver, and most of the mirror frames in the house were his own work. So indeed was his entire mantelpiece around his fireplace in the living room. A splendid design of fruit and foliage and intertwining branches carved in oak. He was a tremendous diary writer. I still have one of his many notebooks from the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Every single day during those 5-year wars, he would write several pages of comment and observation about the events of the time. He wrote with a pen, and although Norwegian was his mother tongue, he always wrote his diaries in perfect English. He harbored a curious theory about how to develop a sense of beauty in the minds of his children. Every time my mother became pregnant, he would wait until the last 3 months of her pregnancy. Then he would announce to her that the glorious walks must begin. These glorious walks consisted of him taking her to places of great beauty, great beauty in the countryside, and walking with her for about an hour each day so she could absorb the splendor of the surroundings. His theory was that if the eye of a pregnant woman was constantly observing the beauty of nature, this beauty would somehow become transmitted to the mind of the unborn baby within her womb, and that baby would grow up to be a lover of beautiful things. This was the treatment that all of his children received before they were born. Chapter 2. Oh, very quick. Kindergarten. 1922 to 23, when he is 6 to 7. I want you to think about a couple of things that we've read so far. I want you to remember the country that Roald Dahl was born in and how tall his grandpa was. Can you remember those two things? In 1920, when I was still only 3, my mother's eldest child, my own sister Astrid, died from appendicitis. She was 7 years old when she died, which was also the age of my own eldest daughter, Olivia, when she died from measles 42 years later. Both of those two things, grade 5s, you don't worry about anymore. Astrid was far and away my father's favorite. He adored her beyond measure, and her sudden death left him literally speechless for days afterwards. He was so overwhelmed with grief that when he himself went down with pneumonia a month or so afterwards, he did not much care whether he lived or died. If they'd had penicillin in those days, neither appendicitis nor pneumonia would have been so much of a threat. But with no penicillin or other magical antibiotical cures, pneumonia in particular was a very dangerous illness indeed. The pneumonia patient on about the 4th or 5th day would invariably reach what is known as the crisis. The temperature soared and the pulse became rapid. The patient had to fight to survive. My father refused to fight. He was thinking, I am quite sure of his beloved daughter, and he was wanting to join her in heaven. So he did. He was 57 years old. My mother now had a lost daughter and a husband, all in the space of a few weeks. Heaven knows what it must have felt like to be hit with a double catastrophe like this. Here she was, a young Norwegian in a foreign land, suddenly having to face all alone the gravest problems and responsibilities. She had 5 children to look after, 3 of her own and 2 by her husband's first wife. And to make matters worse, she herself was expecting another baby in 2 months' time. A less courageous woman would certainly have sold the house and packed her bags and headed straight back to Norway with the children. Over there in her own country, she had her own mother and father willing and waiting to help her, as well as 2 unmarried sisters. But she refused to take the easy way out. Her husband had always stated most emphatically, that he wished all his children to be educated in English schools. They were the best in the world, he used to say. Better by far than the Norwegian ones. Better even than the Welsh ones, despite the fact that he lived in Wales and had a business there. He maintained that there was some kind of magic about English schooling, that the education it provided had caused the inhabitants of a small island to become a great nation and a great empire and to produce the world's greatest literature. No child of mine, he kept saying, is going to school anywhere else but in England. My mother was determined to carry out the wishes of her husband. To accomplish this, she would have to move away from Wales to England, but she wasn't ready for that yet. She must stay here in Wales a while longer, where she knew people who could help and advise her, especially her husband's great friend and partner, Mr. Addinson. But even if she wasn't leaving Wales quite yet, it was essential that she move to a smaller and more manageable house. She had enough children to look after without having to bother about a farm as well. So as soon as her 5th child, another daughter, was born, she sold the house and moved into a smaller one a few miles away in Llandaff. It was called Cumberland Lodge, and it was nothing more than a pleasant, medium-sized suburban villa. So it was in Llandaff 2 years later, when I was 6, that I went to my first school. There he is when he is 6. Cute. The school was a kindergarten run by 2 sisters, Mrs. Cornfield and Miss Tucker, and it was called Elm Tree House. It is astonishing how little one remembers about one's life before the age of 7 or 8. I can tell you all sorts of things that happened to me from 8 onwards, but only very few before that. I went for a whole year to Elm Tree House, but I cannot even remember what my classroom looked like, nor can I picture the faces of Mrs. Cornfield or Miss Tucker, although I'm very sure they were sweet and smiling. I do have a blurred memory of sitting on the stairs and trying over and over again to tie one of my shoelaces, but that's all that comes back to me at this distance of school itself. On the other hand, I can remember very clearly the journeys I made to and from the school because they were so tremendously exciting. Great excitement is probably the only thing that really interests a 6-year-old boy and sticks in his mind. In my case, the excitement centered around my new tricycle. I rode to school on it every day with my eldest sister riding on hers. No grown-ups came with us, and I can remember oh so vividly how the 2 of us used to go racing at enormous tricycle speeds down the middle of the road, and then most glorious of all, when we came to a corner, we would lean to one side and take it on 2 wheels. All this, you must realize, was in the good old days when the sight of a motor car on the street was an event, and it was quite safe for tiny children to go tricycling and whooping their way to school in the center of the highway. So much, then, for my memories of kindergarten 62 years ago. It's not much, but it's all there is left. We're going to leave it at that for today. I hope you enjoyed listening to the first 2 chapters. We get to learn about when he goes into boarding school, which is quite exciting. I hope everyone is having a really great day, and I know that this is a form of technology, but when you're listening to these stories, try and turn off your technology and enjoy just hearing about the amazing life of Roald Dahl. He is my favorite author, still is to this day, and this is one of my favorite books to this day. So I will check in again tomorrow, and we'll read a couple more chapters. Okay, grade 5s, have a great day. Bye.